The night the storm arrived, no one in Chouteau County slept easily. No one except the woman who had already done what needed doing. She went out at 5 in the morning. The temperature was 31 below zero. She stopped at the gate. Somewhere in the dark beyond the fence, 80 cattle were either standing or they were not.
They were in formation, every one of them. The old ones on the windward side, the younger ones at the center, exactly as they had arranged themselves in every storm before this.
She had bet everything on a single calculation, and now, in 31 degrees below zero, she was about to find out if she had been right.
The auctioneer dropped the opening bid to $50 a head, and nobody moved. He dropped it to $40, and the room stayed still. $40 for an animal that would have sold at $65 the previous spring, before the word got around about where they came from and what had been done to them. Denton Hale had been calling bids in this barn for 22 years, and he knew how a room felt when it had already decided, when the collective judgment of every rancher and buyer present had settled into something wordless and fixed. He watched the lot of 80 Highland cattle move through the ring with the expression of a man confirming what he already knew. One hand went up. It belonged to a woman standing at the rail near the east gate, auburn hair loose over the collar of a canvas jacket, a watch on her left wrist, with a cracked face that caught the barn light when she raised her arm. She was the only bidder. Denton Hale looked at her for a moment, then looked at the room, then brought the gavel down, $43 a head, plus $3 each for the processing fee. She paid at the window and drove home in the dark with a stuck wagon pulling hard to the left on the unpaved county road, and did not stop once to check on the animals behind her, because there was nothing to check. She knew what she had bought. That was the difference between her and every other person in that barn who had looked at those cattle and looked away. Her name was Harriet Vane. She was 37 years old. She had been a widow for 2 years, and she had been broke. In the specific and grinding way that ranch debt in Chouteau County, Montana becomes broke, for longer than that. The 212 acres northeast of Larimer Crossing had belonged to her husband Owen's family since his grandfather broke the benchland in 1851, and Owen had run sheep on it the way his father had run sheep on it. And when Owen died of pneumonia in the February of 1882, he left Harriet with the land, $11,000 in operational debt, a 14-year-old work wagon, and a border collie named Soot, who was getting old in the hips and moved in the mornings, with the careful deliberation of an animal accounting for what remained. The freckles across Harriet's nose and cheekbones were from 37 years of outdoor light. The lines around her eyes were from squinting into that light, and from the years before she came back to Montana, when she had been squinting at very different things. She had served in a Union Army logistics depot during the final years of the frontier campaigns, not as a fighter but as the kind of person an operation cannot function without. She learned to manage inventory at scale. She learned to read supply lines the way other people read weather. She learned, above everything else, to predict failure before it happened, to see in the arrangement of numbers and resources the shape of what was coming, and to do this without sentiment and without the kind of hope that clouds a calculation. She came back to Montana in 1878 and married Owen Vane in 1879. He was a good man who understood sheep and understood the land and understood almost nothing else, which was sufficient, and she had loved him in the steady and undemonstrative way that she loved most things that proved themselves reliable. When he died, she grieved in the same register. She did not fall apart. She picked up the notebook she kept on the kitchen shelf, the one where Owen had recorded his flock weights and his hay purchases and his observations about the North Pasture's drainage, and she continued it in her own handwriting, which was smaller and more precise than his. The first year after Owen died, she ran the sheep as he had run them. It was hard in the ordinary way that ranching in Chouteau County was always hard, which is to say it was hard in a way that was expected and manageable and did not surprise anyone. The second year, the operation came up $7,000 short. That was the kind of shortfall that does not announce itself until November, when the grass is gone and the hay is bought and the numbers will not move no matter how many times you run them. It sat in the kitchen with her through that winter, a companion she had not chosen and could not send away. In the spring of 1884, she sold the remaining 38 sheep. She drove them to the auction in Great Falls and came away with $4,200 toward an $11,000 debt, which was not enough to clear it, but enough to see the shape of it clearly. Then she drove back to Larimer Crossing and sat on the porch with Soot and looked at 212 acres of empty grassland and understood that the sheep had not been the answer. The question was what the answer was. She had always been better at problems than at grief, which may have been a flaw or may have been a survival mechanism in which, at 37, she had stopped trying to classify. She opened the notebook and wrote, in the same small, precise hand, sheep not viable, land remains. What does the land want to do? She walked the property for 3 days after that, not inspecting it, exactly. More the way a person reads something a second time when they suspect they missed something on the first pass. She walked the south quarter where Owen had kept the 2 hay sheds, built in the year they married, still solid. She walked the east fence line where the benchland dropped away and came back up. She walked the north quarter, which Owen had used as a through passage and which had always been, in Harriet's understanding of the land, something other than what it was being used for. The coulee ran along the northern edge of the north pasture. It was a natural depression, 8 feet deep at its lowest point and 40 yards across at its widest, the kind of formation the benchland threw up without apology, carved by snowmelt over centuries into a shape that interrupted the wind coming down from the north the way a raised hand interrupts a blow. Owen had used it as a waypoint. Animals crossed it, rested in it briefly, moved on. He had never thought of it as infrastructure because he had never needed to. Harriet stood at the edge of it on the third day and looked at it for a long time. Then she took out the notebook and wrote, Coulee, North Quarter. Natural windbreak, 40 yards across, 8 feet at center, capacity, unknown. Possibility to be determined. She did not know yet what she was going to do with it. But she wrote it down, because writing things down was how she held possibilities open, without committing to them prematurely, and because her father had taught her that the difference between a woman who survives and a woman who doesn't is often nothing more than what she bothers to notice. Her father had given her the watch the summer she left for the depot, standing on the porch of the house where she had grown up in the lower benchland country south of Larimer Crossing. The watch had belonged to his father before him. The face was already cracked when he gave it to her, a clean fracture running from the 2 o'clock position to the 6, bisecting the dial. Still kept perfect time. He held it out to her and said, without ceremony, that a thing keeping time despite its damage was worth knowing about. She had worn it every day since. The crack had not widened. In September of 1884, 3 weeks before the auction in Great Falls, word traveled through the network of grain merchants and sale barn regulars and co-op regulars that comprised the information system of Chouteau County. There was a lot of Highland cattle coming through the ring, 80 head off a failed operation near Chester, up in the high-lying country where the wind was so consistent that the few trees that managed to survive did so at an angle, as if they had given up arguing with it. Previous owner had bought them as a novelty, for their appearance, without understanding what they were, and had managed them into a state of significant neglect without managing them into sickness, which was a distinction that mattered to anyone who knew the breed. Harriet heard about the lot from Silas Odom at the Feed and Supply on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when she came in for mineral blocks. Silas was 58 years old, had known Owen Vane for 30 years, and watched Harriet load mineral blocks into the bed of her wagon with the expression of a man whose arithmetic was producing an answer that confused him. She had been thinking about the lot since she heard. She had been thinking, more precisely, about the coulee, and about what kind of animal could winter in it without infrastructure that she did not have the money to build. She had been through the notebook 3 times. The answer that kept emerging was the same answer. She went to the auction on October 11th. She arrived an hour before the bidding started and walked the rail of the holding pen, where the 80 Highland cattle stood in the particular stillness of animals that are tired but not defeated. They were shaggy in the way that Highland cattle are shaggy, with long reddish-brown coats that fell over their foreheads and wide horns that swept forward and out, and they were thin, that was clear, thin from being managed by someone who had not understood what they were managing. They were not sick. Harriet had been reading cattle bodies for 8 years beside Owen, who had learned from his father, and she could assess condition the way she could assess the notebook, fluently, without having to think about each element individually. She walked the full perimeter of the holding pen slowly. She checked the hooves of every animal she could see clearly through the slats, which was most of them. She looked at their coats, the way they carried their heads, the quality of attention in their eyes. She checked the teeth of 3 animals nearest the east gate. They let her. They watched her with the calm, deep-set eyes of animals that have been managing their own survival for a very long time and have arrived at a settled understanding of what constitutes a threat and what does not. She did not use the notebook. Some assessments live in the hands, not on paper. When Denton Hale opened the bidding at $60, she waited. At 50, she waited. At 40, she raised her hand and held it. Nobody else raised theirs. Denton Hale looked at her, looked at the room and brought the gavel down. She paid $3,680 at the window. Her account held $520 when she left the building. The $11,000 in debt remained exactly where it had been. She drove home in the dark. The wagon pulled to the left on the curves, which was a characteristic of the left rear axle that she had learned to compensate for, with the same automatic adjustment she applied to most things that were slightly wrong in ways that could be managed. She did not stop. The cattle behind her were making the low, intermittent sounds of animals in transit, not distress. She could hear the difference. She put them in the north pasture at 11:30 that night, all 80 of them, opened the gate and let them find their way in. They moved into the dark pasture with the unhurried certainty of animals that understood, on some level below instruction, where the grass was and what they were expected to do with themselves. Soot sat at her left heel and watched them go and did not make a sound. Inside, she opened the notebook. October 11,884 80 head, north pasture, condition thin but sound. Hooves clean, no respiratory signs, eyes clear. Target condition score by Mart 1,885, 35. Variable cost estimate 11.40 per head per month. Assess weight in 30 days. She closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf and went to bed. In the morning, she drove to Silas Odom's to collect the mineral blocks she had ordered the week before and the veterinary thermometer she had put in for in September. Silas helped her load without being asked, the way he had always helped Owen without being asked. And when they had the last bag on the flatbed, he stood with his hands on the tailgate and looked at it for a moment. Highland cattle, not a question. 80 of them. From the Chester lot? Yes. He was quiet while he shifted the bag to balance it better. Those animals been neglected something considerable. They have. They're managing. He nodded once, slowly, in the manner of a man who has more to say and has decided not to say it, which in Harriet's experience meant he would say it to someone else within the week. He did. The feed and supply on the main road through Larimer Crossing was the first node in the county's information system, and what Silas Odom heard on Monday he had generally passed along by Friday. By Thursday of that week, the story had traveled from Silas to Aldous Krebs at the grain co-op on the north end of town, from Aldous Krebs to Denton Hale at the sale barn when they crossed paths on the county road, and from Denton Hale to Meredith Pratt at the county agricultural extension office, who received it with the focused attention of someone filing it in the correct category of her mental ledger. Aldous Krebs was 63 years old and ran 400 Angus cross cattle in a confinement system he had built in 1882 with a federal agricultural loan and a great deal of confidence, which he had expressed at the time in the trade press and continued to express at the co-op on Tuesday mornings, where he spent more time than a man of his stated productivity should. 3 heated barns, a feed delivery system running on a fixed cart track, a veterinary contract with a practice out of Havre that he mentioned often enough that people in Larimer Crossing could recite the name of the lead veterinarian without having met him. The animals in Aldous Krebs's operation almost never saw the outside. He believed this to be a virtue. When he heard about the Chester Highlands and who had bought them and for how much, he said what he said to Silas Odom and what Silas repeated to Denton Hale, that a widow woman going into a Montana winter with 80 thin cattle and no shelter to speak of was going to have a very educational spring. He was not a cruel man. He was a man with strong convictions about the correct way to do things, and other people's errors made him uncomfortable in the specific way that errors make uncomfortable the people who believe they would not have made them. Meredith Pratt drove out to the Vane property on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of October, arriving in the White County wagon with the agricultural extension mark painted on the door and a clipboard under her arm as a professional habit. She was 32 years old and held a degree in animal science from an agricultural college back east, and she believed in data with a totality that sometimes made her difficult to talk to and always made her useful. She stood at the north pasture fence line and watched the 80 Highland cattle spread across the late-season grass with the methodical unhurry of animals that understood precisely how the calories worked. They're underweight. She was looking at the animals when she said it. About 15%. Harriet stood at the fence beside her. They'll correct over winter. Meredith wrote something on the clipboard. Research on cold climate supplementation for animals in recovery indicates performance drops of 30 to 40% through January and February without heated housing. That research applies to animals that haven't adapted to cold environments. Meredith looked up from the clipboard. That's not how genetics functions at this time scale. She said it without unkindness, in the precise register of someone who means something slightly different from what they're saying, which is that she was right, and she needed Harriet to understand that she was right. I'll note your concern. Harriet turned back to the pasture. Meredith wrote something else on the clipboard. She stood at the fence for another few minutes, watching the cattle, and then she got in the county wagon and drove back toward Larimer Crossing. Something about the way the animals were moving, the economy of it, the lack of distress, registered in the part of her mind that kept a running accounting of things that did not match her predictions. She filed it without changing her prediction. It was too early for that. Harriet divided the north pasture into 8 sections of approximately 14 acres each, using the land survey Owen had filed in 1879, and a length of wire bent to the angle that told her grass height relative to moisture content. She moved the cattle through on a schedule she worked out and kept in the notebook, 3 to 4 days per section, adjusted for what she found when she checked each morning. Cattle moved without trouble. They were patient animals, and patient animals agree with careful management the way good timber agrees with a well-set blade. She wrote the dates and the grass heights, and the condition scores she estimated by eye, which she could do accurately to within half a point, because Owen had taught her to read cattle bodies the way fluent readers read text, taking in the whole before the parts, assembling meaning without naming each element. By the 1st of November, all 80 animals had condition scores moving in the right direction, up from the thin baseline she had recorded on arrival. She wrote in the notebook, Nav 1, condition improving across board, all 80 present, moving to Section 3. The neighbor to the east of the Vane property ran his operation on different principles. Aldous Krebs's 3 barns were visible from the county road, long, low structures with ventilation slots at the roofline, insulated and heated and organized around the premise that what an animal needed most was controlled conditions. The cart track feeders ran on a schedule. The Havre veterinary contract specified intervention protocols for every anticipated failure mode. It was an efficient system, which meant it was excellent at everything it had been designed to handle, and which meant it was specifically unprepared for the things it had not. Harriet did not think much about Aldous Krebs's operation. She thought about her notebook, and the grass heights, and the condition scores climbing slowly toward 3.5, and about the $11,000 of debt that sat in the back of her calculations, the way a stone sits at the bottom of a creek, always there, shaping the current around it without being visible from the surface. Her variable cost per head through October was $11.40. She did not mention this at the co-op. She did not go to the co-op in October. November brought the first serious cold, and with it the first test of the thing Harriet had been building since October 11th. The temperature dropped to -22 Fahrenheit on the 18th of November and held there for 5 days. The kind of cold that does not announce itself gradually, but arrives in the night and is simply present in the morning, a new condition that the landscape has accepted and that the animals and the people in it must accept as well. She went out at first light on the 19th and found the 80 cattle in the Coulee, arranged in the formation that Highland cattle arrive at in cold weather without instruction, because the instruction is built into them. The older animals stood on the windward side, their broad backs to the north, their long coats already beginning to crust at the ridge line with the ice that forms an extreme cold and creates, counterintuitively, an insulating shell over the fiber beneath. The younger animals stood toward the center, packed closely, the warmth of their bodies pooling in the depression of the Coulee away from the wind. Harriet moved along the edge of the formation, close enough to assess, but not close enough to disturb it. She used the veterinary thermometer on the ears of a dozen animals, working methodically from east to west, cold on the surface, normal temperature inside. The right ratio, the ratio that meant the animals were managing their own thermal regulation in exactly the manner they had been managing it, as a breed, for longer than anyone's records went back. She wrote in the notebook Nov 1922. 80 head accounted for, formation intact, windward animals showing ice crust on ridge, correct response. Ear tomps, surface cold, interior normal, no distress indicators, continuing. Meredith Pratt sent a letter from the extension office at the start of December, asking with the careful neutrality of a scientist collecting data. She had not expected how the cattle were managing in the cold. Harriet wrote back with the numbers from the notebook, the condition scores, the ear temperatures, the movement records. She received a second letter within the week. The opening line said that Meredith was going to look more carefully at the literature on unconfined cold climate management for heritage breeds. The tone of someone who has found a discrepancy they cannot immediately explain. The second letter also mentioned something Meredith had been meaning to pass along. The Extension Office was compiling a preliminary report on heritage breed performance, and in the course of that work she had made contact with a businessman from Helena, a man named Walter Price, who worked in the specialty beef trade and had expressed interest in locating reliable sources of Highland cattle. She had no reason to think the timing was right. She mentioned it only as a matter of completeness. Harriet read the letter twice at the kitchen table. She said nothing in response to that particular paragraph. That evening she opened the notebook and wrote, Walter Price, Helena, specialty beef trade. Question, does the herd qualify as a viable supply source? Answer, unknown. Revisit spring. She closed the notebook. December moved through the benchland in the way of Montana Decembers, which is to say it moved slowly and with conviction. The cold settled in and did not leave. The cattle moved through their sections according to the schedule, grazed the late dead grass, drank from the creek that Harriet kept open with a hand-chopped channel. She cleared each morning, before first light, swinging the axe along the same 12-foot stretch of ice until the dark water showed beneath. It took 20 minutes. She wrote it in the notebook as a fixed daily labor cost, as she wrote every expenditure of time and money, because the notebook was not a journal. It was a record of a business she was operating, and she ran it like one. On the 9th of December, she went out at her usual time and found number 1 at the edge of the Coulee. She had not named any of the cattle formally, but she had been watching them long enough to know the individuals, the way any person who watches a group carefully comes to know its members without intending to, and the cow she thought of as number 1 was the oldest animal in the lot, a broad-shouldered animal with a wider horn sweep than the others, and a manner of carrying herself that suggested long authority. She was always on the windward edge of the formation. She was in some functional sense that Harriet respected, the one who defined where the formation was. Number 1 was lying down at the railed edge of the Coulee, separated from the rest of the herd by 30 feet of open ground. She was not thrashing. She was not vocalizing. She was simply down, in the way that old animals sometimes go down, and the rest of the herd was where it should be, and there was a 30-foot gap between them that felt, in the cold night, like something important. Harriet crouched down beside her. Soot had not come out. The cold had been hard on the dog's hips since October, and by December she rarely left the porch in the mornings until the sun had been up for an hour. Harriet was alone in the dark coulee with 80 cattle, and one of them was lying in the wrong place, and the temperature was 18 below zero, and her account held $520 against $11,000 of debt, and she had been making every decision correctly for 2 months, and correctness, she understood in that moment, was not the same thing as certainty. She took out the notebook. The habit was so ingrained that she had it out before she realized she had nothing to write. She held it in her gloved hand. The page was blank. She sat beside number 1 with the notebook open to a blank page and the veterinary thermometer in her other hand, unused, and she thought about the 212 acres and the debt and Owen's handwriting in the first half of the notebook and the coulee and the 80 cattle and the 7,000 shortfall in the second year, and whether she had read this correctly or whether she had done what the previous owner of these cattle had done, which was to choose something for reasons that sounded correct and proceed without understanding what she had. She sat there. Number 1's breathing was regular. Slow but regular. At some point past 2 in the morning, the old cow shifted her weight. She did it slowly, the way old animals shift, taking stock of each limb before committing to the movement. She got her front legs under her. She paused. She got the back legs under her. Stood there for a moment in the dark, her breath coming in slow plumes, and then she walked, without hurry, back to the windward edge of the formation. She stood in her place. The gap closed. Harriet sat in the coulee for a while after that. She was not thinking about anything in particular. She had her hand on the cracked face of the watch on her left wrist, feeling the fracture line under her glove. Temperature was still 18 below. The wind had dropped. She went inside. In the morning she wrote, Deck 9, 1,884. Number 1 separated from formation down, riling edge of coulee, approximately 10 p.m. to 2:15 a.m. No signs of illness, self-recovered, age-related rest event, not pathological. Monitor system continues. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the north pasture in the early light, the long, low forms of 80 Highland cattle moving through the frost with the patience of animals that understood they had all the time they needed. January was cold in the way that Montana January is cold, which is to say it was serious and specific about it and did not soften toward the middle of the month the way cold sometimes does in places with less conviction. The wind came down from the north, and the cattle moved through their sections and drank from the creek channel. Harriet opened each morning and ate the mineral blocks and the second-cut hay she had laid in during September, $812 worth from a farm 12 miles south, stacked in the larger of Owen's 2 hay sheds. Her variable cost per head in January was $11.40, same as October, same as November, same as December. The consistency of it was something she noted in the margin of the notebook without drawing conclusions from it yet, because conclusions required sufficient data, and she had not reached sufficient data. Aldous Krebs ran his January operation from his heated office in the equipment building adjacent to the barns. The cart track feeders ran on schedule. The barns held at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. He made it to the co-op on Tuesdays and talked about his supplementation protocol, which the Havre veterinary practice had designed and which cost, by the calculation that Silas Odom had done on the back of a receipt one afternoon, somewhere between $60 and $80 per head per month, not counting the fixed costs of the system itself. On the 2nd of February, the weather telegraph out of the Great Falls Signal Station issued a blizzard warning for Chouteau County and the surrounding region. The warning language included the phrase, potentially historic, which people in the county read with the specific attention they gave to phrases they had heard before and which had sometimes been accurate and sometimes not. They read the sky. They read the wind. Then they drove to town for what they needed and went home and waited to see which kind of storm this was. It was the right kind, the kind that earns its language. It started as snow at 11 o'clock that night, the fine dry kind that comes with very cold air, and by 3 in the morning it had become something that required a different vocabulary. Temperature dropped through the night, passing -20 and continuing. The wind out of the north built steadily, hitting 54 miles per hour sustained before midnight and not dropping below it. The snow it carried was not falling snow. It was moving snow, horizontal, finding every gap in every structure it encountered and filling it according to the rules of pressure and fluid dynamics, which do not negotiate. Harriet had gone out at 10 o'clock that night before the worst of it arrived. She found the cattle in the coulee in their formation. She counted 80. She checked the creek channel, which she had opened that morning, and which had begun to reseal at the edges but remained passable at the center. She checked the mineral overhang, the simple structure she had built in October from $40 of lumber and an afternoon's work, and found it intact. She went inside and went to bed. She was up at 5 in the morning. She dressed in the full cold weather kit she had learned to assemble efficiently in her depot years, layers in the right order, face cover, lantern lit and hanging from her left hand. She went out into the dark and the wind and the moving snow. Cattle were in the coulee. The formation was intact. The animals on the windward side had ice sheeting the ridge of their long coats, crusted and solid, a shell the wind could not penetrate because it was made of wind's own work. The animals in the center were standing close. All 80 were present. She moved along the edge of the formation and used the veterinary thermometer on a dozen animals as she had done in November, and the readings came back the same. Surface cold, interior normal, the right ratio. She counted 80. She went back inside. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote in the notebook. Feb 3, 1,885. Blizzard, 31 mile for height. Wind 54 miles, gusts higher. 80 head accounted for. Formation intact. Ice crust on windward animals. Correct response. Ear temps normal. Creek channel holding. Mineral cover intact. No injuries. No losses. Continuing. Then she made coffee and sat with Soot, who had come in from the porch sometime in the night and was asleep on the kitchen floor with her head on Harriet's boot, and waited for the light to come up over the benchland and show her what the storm had left. What the storm left was silence first. The particular silence that follows a blizzard in the benchland country. A silence that is not the absence of sound but the presence of something heavier, as if the air itself had been pressed flat and had not yet decided to rise again. The wind had stopped sometime before dawn. The snow had stopped with it. The benchland lay under a sky the color of old pewter, and the drifts ran in long, smooth shapes across the county road and across the flat of the south pasture and against the leeward wall of Owen's equipment shed in a formation that was almost architectural in its precision. Harriet stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at it. The cattle were moving. She could see them from the window, the dark shapes of them and against the white, moving with the unhurried patience of animals that had passed through the night as a simple fact of existence, and were now returning to the ordinary business of the day. She had already been out once, at first light, and counted them and checked the formation and confirmed what she had recorded at 5 in the morning. 80, all 80. The Coulee had held. She dressed again and went out to check the creek. She chopped the channel open along its full length, the axe biting clean through a night's worth of new ice, and the water ran dark and steady beneath. The cattle were already moving toward it in the loose, unhurried file of animals that know where the water is. She checked the mineral overhang and walked the perimeter of the north pasture fence line, looking for drift damage. The drifts had pressed against the leeward sections of the fence, but had not broken the posts. She made note of the 2 sections where the wire would need checking in the spring, then went back to the house. The news about Aldous Krebs reached her that afternoon. It came from Silas Odom, who sent a boy with a written note in the careful, measured language Silas used for information he was not certain how to characterize. Aldous had lost 19 head in Barn 2. Another 43 animals were showing effects of the cold in varying degrees, 8 of them serious enough that the veterinary team from Havre, when the roads open enough to travel, would be required. Harriet read the note twice and set it on the table. She was sorry. She meant it precisely and without complication. Aldous Krebs had been wrong about a number of things, but being wrong does not make a loss less real, and 19 animals dead in a barn that was built to prevent exactly that is not a failure of character. It is a failure of design meeting conditions the design did not anticipate. She went back to the notebook. What had happened to Aldous Krebs's barn was not a mystery, not to anyone who understood how heated structures behave when the stoves fail in extreme cold. The insulated walls held the cold out only as long as the heat sources held the warmth in. When the coal supply to the barn stoves was cut off by the drifts blocking the coal house door, the 2 forces equalized. The dry horizontal snow that the storm carried had worked into the gaps at the top of the barn doors on the leeward side, where the pressure differential created by the drifts pressing against the exterior was highest, and by 6 in the morning 2 of those doors had shifted enough in their frames to leave gaps that admitted the wind without admitting the animals an exit. Cold poured in from the top. The cattle could not get out through the drifted base. The combination was what it was. Harriet's cattle had spent the night in a hole in the ground, with the wind passing over them and their own metabolisms doing the work that generations of cold climate breeding had equipped them to do. The Coulee was not a barn. It did not have doors that could be forced. It did not have heating systems that could fail. It had the same physics it had always had, which was the physics of the Earth's own contours, and those had held. She wrote in the notebook that evening, Feb 3, 1,885. Storm concluded. Krebs lost 19 head confirmed, Barn 2 43 additional affected. Cost of confinement failure and extreme cold event TBD, my loss 0. Infrastructure investment to date, 40 mineral cover, 912 hay 11. 40 per head monthly variable. System continues. She closed the notebook. The story moved through Larimer crossing the way. Stories move through small communities, which is quickly and with additions that accumulate as the story passes from one person to the next. Some of the additions accurate and some of them not. By the afternoon of February 4th, the version circulating through the county had Aldous losing 30 head, and the version traveling alongside it had Harriet Vane standing in the blizzard at midnight, with a lantern held high while her cattle stood in formation around her, which was not accurate but was not entirely untrue in spirit. The true version was quieter. She had gone out twice. She had counted 80. She had gone back inside. The true version did not require embellishment because the number was sufficient on its own. 80 cattle, minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, no losses. The arithmetic spoke without help. Meredith Pratt rode out on the Thursday following the storm. The road had been cleared on Wednesday afternoon, and the benchland was in the particular stillness that follows a clearing. The snow settled, the sky blue, the cold specific and dry. She tied her horse at the gate and walked to the fence line with her clipboard and stood and looked. The 80 Highland cattle were in Section 7 of the North Pasture, which was where the rotation schedule had put them. They were moving through the snow with the methodical patience of animals that know there is grass beneath it, pawing through the crust with their broad front hooves, uncovering the dead grass in small irregular patches, working a section of ground before moving to the next. The sound of it carried in the cold air. Meredith watched them for a long time without writing anything on the clipboard. Harriet came out from the house and stood at the fence beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The pawing behavior. Meredith's breath came in small plumes. Is that learned? It's instinctive. They don't need to be shown. Meredith wrote something. The condition scores you gave me in December. Were those estimates or measured? Estimated by eye. Owen taught me. I'm accurate to within half a point. The literature suggests eye estimation for condition scoring has a standard deviation of approximately 0.6 points in handlers with less than 5 years consistent experience. A pause. You have 8 years. 9, if you count the year before Owen died. Meredith wrote something else. She turned slightly, not toward Harriet but away from the cattle, looking at the creek line where the chopped channel was visible as a thin dark seam in the white. You kept the water open through the storm. Chopped it every morning. Takes 20 minutes. Meredith turned back to the cattle. The look on her face was the look of a person running a calculation that is not producing the result the model predicted, and who is deciding whether the model is wrong or whether the data is insufficient. In Harriet's experience, the people who decided it was the data were the ones who made the same mistakes repeatedly. Meredith Pratt did not seem like one of those people. She seemed like someone who was very close to revising her model and was not yet ready to say so. The formation they used during the storm. Meredith pointed her pencil toward the cattle, the older animals on the windward side. How did they determine which animals were assigned which position? They weren't assigned. The formation is self-organizing. On what basis? Experience and physical condition. The animals most capable of managing the cold take the positions that require it. The younger and weaker ones are in the center. The formation adjusts as conditions change. Meredith was quiet. She wrote steadily for a moment, then she stopped writing. She looked at the cattle. She looked at the notebook Harriet was holding. May I see your records? Harriet handed her the notebook. Meredith read through it with the focused attention of someone who reads data the way other people read correspondence, looking for what the numbers mean and not just what they say. She read the October entries, the condition scores moving up from the thin baseline. The November entries, the first cold snap, the ear temperatures. The December entry about number 1. The January entries, consistent and without drama. The February 3rd entry with its specific numbers and its final 2 words. She looked at the February 3rd entry for a moment longer than the others. Then she closed the notebook and handed it back. The literature on cold climate performance for heritage breeds in unconfined systems is considerably thinner than it should be. She said it with the flatness of someone making a factual observation and not a concession. Yes. Harriet took the notebook. I've been drafting a preliminary report on heritage breed performance for the Extension Office. I'd like to include your records, you may. Meredith turned to face her directly for the first time in the conversation. I want to be precise about what I'm saying. This is one operation, one winter, one set of conditions. The data is significant, but it is not a sufficient basis for general conclusions, I understand. I also want to be precise about the other thing I'm saying, which is that the data you have recorded contradicts the performance predictions I gave you in October, and I don't have a satisfactory alternative explanation for that contradiction. Paused. I wanted to say that clearly. Harriet looked at her. I appreciate that. Meredith picked up her clipboard and walked back toward her horse. She paused at the gate. Without turning, she said, the animals are in good condition. Then she mounted and rode back toward Larimer Crossing. Harriet stood at the fence for another moment. Cattle were still working through the snow in Section 7, methodical and unhurried. Number 1 was at the north edge of the group, moving slightly ahead of the others, her wide horns catching the morning light. She had been at the windward edge of every formation since December 9th. She was going to be there, Harriet thought, for as long as she had the strength to get there. February moved through the benchland in its usual manner, which was slowly and with continued opinions about temperature. The blizzard was the worst of it, but what followed was not mild. The cold stayed below 0 through the middle of the month, and the wind came back in shorter episodes that were less severe than the storm, but were not nothing. Harriet ran the rotation through sections 7, 8, and 1, which put the cattle into the east sections, where the grass had been untouched since October. The grass under the snow was dry and compressed, but it was there, and the cattle found it with their hooves and ate it with the systematic patience that was their characteristic mode in all things. She went out twice a day. She counted 80 each time. She recorded ear temperatures twice a week and condition scores on Sundays. The scores held at 3.2 through the middle of February and began moving toward 3.3 in the final week. The target was 3.5 by March. She was on pace. The story about Aldous Krebs's losses had moved through several stages by the middle of February. The initial count of 19 had been confirmed. The 43 animals with cold effects had been assessed by the veterinary team from Havre, who had made the trip as soon as the roads permitted. 8 animals had required treatment. The rest had recovered or were recovering. The barn 2 door had been repaired with lumber from Aldis's equipment shed. The total cost of the storm, including the dead animals, the veterinary bill, the emergency repairs, and the lost production from the affected animals, was not a number Aldous Krebs shared with anyone. But Silas Odom had an approximate sense of it from the supplies Aldous had needed in the 2 weeks following the storm, and it was a number that Silas kept to himself out of the same courtesy that made him not mention Harriet's variable costs at the co-op. Aldous Krebs did not come to the co-op in February. In March, the temperature began to move in the direction of something that might, in another month, become spring. The snow on the benchland settled and began to pull back from the south-facing slopes, and the grass that emerged was still brown and matted, but it was there, and the cattle knew it before she did. Moving to the sections where the snow retreated without needing to be directed. She moved them to Section 1 on the 5th of March, which was 1 day earlier than the rotation scheduled, because Section 1 was the southeast section and the snow was off at first. On the 7th of March, she did the Sunty condition assessment. She moved through the herd methodically, estimating each animal's score by the standards Owen had taught her, recording each one in the notebook. When she had the full count, she sat on the fence rail and added the column. She divided by 83.5. She looked at the number for a moment. Then she looked at the entry she had made on October 12th, the day after she brought the herd home, when the animals were thin and uncertain on their new pasture, and the account held $520, and the winter was ahead of her. Target condition score by March 1,885.35. The date she had set was the 1st of March. It was the 7th. She was 6 days behind the target she had written in October. She wrote in the notebook, March 7, 1,885. Condition score 35, full herd average. Target achieved, 80 head present, all sound. She closed the notebook and got off the fence rail and walked back to the house. Soot was on the porch in the thin March sun, her muzzle on her front paws, tracking Harriet's movement with her eyes. Harriet sat down beside her on the porch step. The north pasture was visible from there, the cattle in their morning movement through Section 1, the benchland running north in the pale light. She had done what she said she would do. The notebook said so. It was enough to have done it. It did not require more than that. Meredith Pratt submitted her report to the Montana Stock Growers newsletter in the 3rd week of March. She sent Harriet a copy before she submitted it, which was a courtesy she had not been required to extend. It was 3 paragraphs. Every sentence was factual. Every number came from the notebook, which Harriet had shared with Meredith in full, and which Meredith had used exactly as it was given to her, without interpretation beyond what the numbers supported. The report described an unconfined cold climate management trial using Highland cattle on benchland property in Chouteau County, Montana. It listed the acquisition cost at $43 per head, the variable operating cost at $11.40 per head per month, and the outcome across the 5-month trial period ending March 1,885 as 0 losses through a weather event the National Weather Service had designated historic, with condition improvement of 1 full point across the full herd of 80 animals. It identified the management technique as heritage breed physiological adaptation in unconfined cold climate conditions, and it listed the source as Harriet Vane, Larimer Crossing, Chouteau County. Harriet read it twice. She sent back a single correction, a date she had given Meredith incorrectly in one of their letters. Meredith corrected it. The report was submitted. The newsletter published it in April. It appeared in the back section, 3 paragraphs among the longer articles about supplementation protocols and cattle genetics and the upcoming county extension meetings for the spring planting season. It was not prominently placed. It did not need to be. The people who read the newsletter read all of it, including the back section. And the people who read those 3 paragraphs and recognize numbers in them understood what they meant without requiring explanation. Silas Odom received his copy of the newsletter on the Tuesday it arrived. He was behind the counter when he read it. Mid-morning, and the 3 paragraphs took him less time to read than the article about supplementation that preceded it, but he read it twice. Then he went into the back and came out with a pair of scissors and cut the 3 paragraphs out of the newsletter along the column margins. He carried the clipping to the bulletin board above the register, where the announcement for the County 4-H show and the card from the water well service had been since January, and he pinned the clipping above them. He did not send word to Harriet to tell her. He thought about it and decided it was the kind of thing that explained itself. What happened next was what happened when Joan Ferris came into the store the following Thursday for grain and read the clipping on the bulletin board. What? She asked Silas what it was about, and Silas read it to her out loud, standing behind the counter with the newsletter clipping in one hand. Joan Ferris listened, nodding slowly in the way of a woman following a story she has not heard before. When Silas reached the end of the 3 paragraphs, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the tone of someone who has been thinking about how to say something and has decided that the simple version is the correct one, that a thing keeping time despite its damage was worth knowing about. Joan Ferris did not know what he meant. She bought her grain and drove home. In May, the benchland had come as fully into spring as Chouteau County's benchland comes into spring, which is to say there was grass and there was sun and the wind was cold and the sky was large and the light had a quality that was not quite warmth but was moving in that direction. The cattle were in the south pasture which she had moved them to in March to let the north rest, and they were moving through it with the ease of animals that had long since settled into their land and their routine. It was Meredith Pratt who made the introduction. She sent word through the extension office that a man named Walter Price would be riding up from Helena on the 15th of May and would appreciate an hour of Harriet's time if she was willing, and that his business in heritage beef was legitimate and his reputation in Helena was good. Harriet sent word back that she was willing. Walter Price arrived on a good horse with Helena road dust on his coat and the manner of a man who has ridden a long distance and is not going to let it show. He was somewhere past 50, lean, with the kind of careful economy of movement that suggests long practice at assessing things quickly and deciding what they're worth. He shook Harriet's hand at the gate and did not look at her the way men sometimes looked at a woman running land alone, which was a way that contained a question she had grown tired of answering. He looked at the cattle. They walked the south pasture together while the 80 Highland cattle grazed around them without alarm. The animals had accepted human presence in the pasture with the calm that is characteristic of the breed, and that Harriet had reinforced through 5 months of twice-daily checks, so that by May the cattle understood, in whatever way animals understand recurring patterns, that people walking near them was not a thing requiring a response. Walter Price asked about the winter. She described it in the same terms she had used in her letters to Meredith, the same numbers, the same sequence. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had learned to appreciate in people, the ability to receive information without needing to comment on it as it arrived. He asked about the feed composition, and she showed him the notebook. He read through it with the focused attention of a businessman reading a ledger, which was essentially what it was. He asked about the creek management and the mineral blocks and the rotation schedule, and she answered each question with the same specificity the notebook held. He asked about her plans for the following year. This was the first time she had said aloud what she had been working out in the notebook over the previous 3 weeks, since the condition scores hit 3.5, and the newsletter clipping went up on Silas's board, and the lease question had moved from a note in the margin to a line item in the next year's planning. She told him she intended to expand. She intended to take the north section lease from the county land bank, which had been available since the previous holder let it go in 1882, and which she had been tracking since November when she wrote it in the notebook as a possibility. 40 to 50 additional head, same management approach. Walter Price looked at the cattle for a moment. One of the younger animals had wandered to within 10 feet of where they stood and was standing there with the placid curiosity that Highland cattle sometimes express toward people they have decided are not a concern. This is an unusual sourcing story. He said it with the flatness of a statement, not a compliment. He looked at her. These are quality animals. Both words arrived with the precision of a man who used them at specific temperatures and not otherwise, which meant they meant what they said. They walked back to the gate. He asked 2 more questions about the rotation system, practical questions about the section sizes and the seasonal grass height variation, and she answered them from the notebook numbers she carried in her head because she had written them often enough that they were there without needing to look. Then he said he would like to draw up a preliminary agreement for the following fall harvest, contingent on the expanded herd meeting certain condition standards at time of purchase, which he specified and which were standards the current herd exceeded by almost half a point. She said that was acceptable. The agreement was not a contract yet. It was an intention between 2 people who had each assessed the other and decided the assessment was positive. But an intention of that kind, from a man in the Helena specialty trade with a good reputation and a long ride behind him, was not a nothing. It was a change in the shape of what was possible. After Walter Price rode back down the county road, Harriet went inside and sent a letter to the county land bank that afternoon with the neighbor's boy carrying it to town. The north section lease was available. It had been available for 3 years, since the previous leaseholder had let it expire and no one else had applied. She had known this from the land bank's published register, which she had checked in November and again in January. She had written it in the notebook in November as a question, North Lease Section, County Land Bank, still available. She had not written to ask then because writing in November would have been premature. She wrote now because it was no longer premature. The land bank officer, a man named Aldrich, who had a slow, careful way of putting things that Harriet had encountered twice before, confirmed the section was available by return post. He confirmed the lease terms. He said he could have the paperwork ready by the end of the following week. She replied that was fine. She put the letter down and sat at the kitchen table. The window showed the south pasture and the cattle moving through it in the afternoon light. She opened the notebook to the page from November where she had written the north least section as a question and drew a line through the question mark. Not through the words, through the mark that meant unknown. June came into the benchland and brought the grass with it. The grass on Harriet's north and south pastures came in at the height Owen had noted as optimal in the notebook's earliest entries, which she had read carefully enough in the first year after his death that she knew his observations as well as her own. She moved the cattle back to the north pasture on the 6th of June, rotating them through the sections in the same sequence she had established in October. The grass recovered from its winter compression, and growing in the long days that Montana's latitude provided in June, light until nearly 9 in the evening, the kind of growing season that made up for the length of the opposite. The 80 cattle had become a category of things she understood the way she understood the land itself, which is to say specifically, and without having to assemble the understanding from its components each time, because the understanding was already there, already in her hands and in the notebook and in the particular attention she gave the herd twice a day. She knew which animals ate first and which held back. She knew the social arrangements of the herd, which animals moved together and which kept a certain distance. She knew number one's movement patterns well enough to notice when they changed, though since December they had not changed in any way that required notation. Soot's hips had been getting worse through the spring, and by June the dog moved with a deliberate economy that was different from her earlier deliberateness, which had been the deliberateness of attention. This was the deliberateness of conservation, of a body that has taken stock of what it has left and is allocating it carefully. The veterinarian in Larimer Crossing had told Harriet in April what she already knew, which was that it was age and there was not a treatment for that, only a management of the timeline. Soot still came to the pasture gate every morning and stood there looking at the cattle, which was a habit she had maintained since the first year after Owen died. When she had learned that her job was to know where the animals were, and she had decided that the gate was the right place to do that job when there was no specific work to be done. Harriet stood at the gate one evening in the 3rd week of June with her hand resting on Soot's back, feeling the slow, steady breathing under her palm, and watched the 80 Highland cattle in the long northern light. The sun was still above the horizon at 8 o'clock, throwing itself across the benchland at the low angle that June evenings produced, and the light hit the long coats of the cattle at that angle and turned them a color that Harriet did not have a precise name for, something between copper and amber and the specific red-brown of creek water over iron-rich stone. And the way it moved when the animals moved was not a thing you could adequately describe to someone who had not stood at that gate at that hour and seen it. She touched the watch on her left wrist. The crack ran from the 2 o'clock position to the 6, the same as it always had. She had heard from Joan Ferris about what Silas Odom had said 3 weeks after it happened, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely at the Saturday market in Great Falls. Joan had mentioned it the way a person mentions something that has stayed with them, without their quite knowing why, pulling it out of one part of a conversation and dropping it into another. She told Harriet that Silas had read the 3 paragraphs aloud behind his counter on a Thursday morning, and when he reached the end he had stood there a moment and said that a thing keeping time despite its damage was worth knowing about. Joan had not understood the remark and had said so. She told the story anyway. Harriet had understood it. She stood at the gate with her hand on Soot's back, and the benchland running north in the evening light, and the cattle moving through Section 1 in the long gold of it, and she did not think of anything in particular. She was not the kind of person who narrated her own life to herself. She was the kind of person who ran a calculation and recorded the result and moved to the next problem. The calculation at this moment was not complex. The herd was healthy. The lease was signed. The agreement with Walter Price was in the kitchen drawer. The target she had set in October had been met in March. The debt was still there, the same stone at the bottom of the creek, but the current was running differently around it now. Stone had not moved. Everything else had. Aldous Krebs had driven past on the county road twice in May, his wagon moving slowly, and once she had seen it stop. She had not been close enough to tell if he was looking at her cattle or looking at the road or looking at nothing in particular, which was something men in his situation sometimes did, drove slowly and looked at the middle distance and worked on something they had not yet decided how to think about. She did not know what that meant for what he would do next. That was his calculation, not hers. She had heard from Silas that he had not rebuilt Barn 2, that the door was repaired but the barn was standing as it had stood, drift marks still visible on the leeward wall, and she thought she understood what that meant, even if Aldous did not yet. The evening light moved across the pasture the way June light moves on the Montana benchland, not fading so much as deepening, the colors shifting through registers that had no common names. The cattle moved through it. Soot breathed under Harriet's hand. Aldous Krebs came to Silas Odom's on a Wednesday morning in the 2nd week of July, which was not his usual day and not his usual hour, and Harriet was there when he arrived because she had come in early for a fence staple order that Silas had been holding for 2 weeks. She was at the counter when she heard the wagon and turned to see Aldous stepping down from it with the particular deliberateness of a man who has made a decision he is not entirely comfortable with and is carrying it anyway. He came through the door and saw her and did not stop walking, which told her the visit was not accidental. Mrs. Vane. He took off his hat, a habit he had with women regardless of circumstance, and held it at his side. Mr. Silas had gone to the back for the staple order. The store was quiet. The smell of it was the permanent smell of Silas Odom's mineral supplement and cut timber, and the particular dusty sweetness of bulk grain. Aldous looked at the bulletin board above the register. The clipping was still there, above the 4-H notice, its edges beginning to yellow at the corners. He looked at it for a moment without saying anything, then looked at her. "I drove past your south pasture last Tuesday." He turned his hat brim in his hands once, a single rotation. "Cattle looked well. They are well." He nodded. He did not look at the clipping again, but she understood he was aware of it the way a person is aware of something in a room that they have decided not to look at directly. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I'm not asking it to argue with you or to find fault with what you've done. I'm asking because I don't understand it, and I've been trying to understand it since February, and I haven't gotten there on my own." She waited. "How did you know?" He said it without inflection, not an accusation, not a compliment. A genuine question from a man who had built his operation on the principle that the correct answer to any agricultural problem could be found in the right system, properly maintained, and who had watched his system fail in a single night. She thought about how to answer it honestly. "I didn't know the storm was going to be what it was. Nobody knew that, no. I mean before that. How did you know those cattle would winter the way they did?" Harriet looked at the counter for a moment. "I read them. At the sale barn before the bidding. I walked the rail and I read them the way Owen taught me to read cattle. And what I read was animals that were thin from neglect and sound from their own constitution. And then I thought about what I had, which was a Coulee and benchland grass and an $11,000 debt, and I thought about what they were, which was a breed that has been managing cold without help for longer than this county has had a name. I decided the match was correct." Aldous was quiet for a long time. Silas came back from the storeroom with the staple order in a paper sack and read the room and set the sack on the counter and went back into the storeroom without being asked. "My cost per head this winter." Aldous looked at the far wall. "All in, not counting the losses." He paused. $91. She did not respond to that. "Yours was $11.40, yes." He put his hat back on and straightened it once, carefully. "I'm not going to rebuild barn 2. I've been going back and forth on it since March, and I'm done going back and forth. I'm not rebuilding it." He looked at her directly. "I don't know yet what I'm going to put in that space instead. But I'm done putting heated infrastructure between my cattle and the weather and calling it management." It was the longest speech she had heard Aldous Krebs deliver outside of the co-op, and it had none of the quality of his co-op speeches, which were performances. This was a man reporting a conclusion he had arrived at alone, and was stating as plainly as he knew how. That's a significant change, it is. He moved toward the door. "I may come ask you more questions. If that's acceptable." "It's acceptable." He went out. She heard the wagon move down the road. Silas came back from the storeroom and set a second paper sack on the counter and looked at the door. "Well," he said, which was the entirety of his commentary. She paid for the staples and drove home. The lease paperwork for the north section came through in the last week of June, and the signed copy was in the kitchen drawer beside Walter Price's preliminary agreement, both in their own envelopes, which was a filing system Owen had used and which she had continued. 2 documents in 2 envelopes in a kitchen drawer represented, in aggregate, a future that was different in shape from the future that had been available to her in October. Not secure, not resolved, but different in a way that direction requires. The debt was still there. The difference was that the operation now had a trajectory the debt did not. She had gone over the numbers for the expanded herd 3 times in June, working in the notebook at the kitchen table in the evenings when the light held late enough to make the work easy. 40 additional head, which was the lower end of what she had told Walter Price, because the north section's grass capacity in the first year was an estimate, and she was not the kind of person who built plans on the optimistic end of an estimate. 40 head at $43 each would run her $1,620 at the auction, assuming a comparable lot was available. She had enough set aside for it. Barely, but barely was sufficient when the calculation was correct. The condition scores through July held at 3.6, above the target she had achieved in March, a margin she had not planned for but recorded as a positive deviation from the model. Cattle were on the north pasture now, the rotation running through the sections in the same sequence she had established in October, and which had become, over 9 months, a rhythm she maintained the way she maintained any well-functioning system, with attention but without anxiety. Number 1 was in the herd. This was not a thing she noted in the notebook because it was not a data point. But she was aware of it each time she counted the herd, aware in the specific way that you are aware of the continued presence of something that has been tested and held. The old cow moved with the same authority she had always moved with, a half step ahead of the nearest animals, her wide horns at the precise angle that conveyed nothing threatening but communicated, clearly, that she knew where she was going. On the night in December when she had gone down at the Coulee's edge and risen, again before 3 in the morning and walked back to the windward side of the formation without assistance or instruction, she had demonstrated something that Harriet had not known how to write in the notebook and had not tried to write. Some things were not data. In August, Meredith Pratt came out again. This was not an official visit. She came on a Saturday, which was not a workday for the extension office, and she came without the clipboard, which Harriet noticed immediately, and which she understood to mean the visit was different in kind from the previous ones. Meredith stood at the north pasture fence and watched the cattle for a while before she spoke. The report generated more response than I expected. 3 ranchers from Park County wrote to the extension office, 2 from Meagher County. There's a man in Cascade County who runs a mixed herd and wants to know if I can point him toward comparable literature on unconfined heritage management. What did you tell him? That the literature is thin and what exists is largely inconclusive, and that the most useful data I currently have access to comes from a single operation in Chouteau County. She paused. I also told him I was working on a longer paper. Harriet looked at her. A proper research paper, not a newsletter item. I've been in correspondence with the animal science faculty at an agricultural college since April. They want a co-authored piece on heritage breed cold climate performance using your records as the primary data set. Meredith turned from the cattle. With your permission, you have it. There's one thing I want to be clear about. Meredith's manner was the same manner she had brought to every conversation they had, the precise directness that could read as cold and was not. The paper will say what the data says, nothing more. If the data is replicated across other operations over the next several years, the conclusions may become stronger. At the moment, they are significant but limited. I won't overstate them. I wouldn't want you to. Meredith looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite surprise. Most people who have done something unusual want it stated as broadly as possible. Most people haven't kept a notebook. Meredith almost smiled. It was a brief expression gone before it fully formed, but it was there. She turned back to the cattle. Number 1 is still leading. Yes. She went down in December and self-recovered. She did. The recovery rate for recumbency events in cattle of her age is not high without intervention. I know. She seems unconcerned about the statistics. Harriet looked at the old cow moving through the section at the front of the group, her broad back steady, her horns at their characteristic angle. She is. Meredith left an hour later, riding back toward Larimer Crossing. Harriet went inside and stood at the window, looking at the north pasture for a minute before she went back to the work of the afternoon, which was repairing the Section 4 fence where a post had worked loose in the summer dry. The fall sale in Great Falls was scheduled for the second week of September, and Harriet drove down on the 9th and looked at the available lots before the bidding started. There was no lot of Highland cattle on the schedule. There were 3 lots of Hereford crosses and 2 of mixed Angus, and there was a lot of 15 Highland cattle from an operation near Lewistown that had downsized following a change in ownership. 15 was not 40, but 15 at $40 or $50 a head was a manageable addition to the herd while she waited for a larger lot to come available. She walked the rail for the Lewistown Highlands and read them the way she always read cattle, with her hands and her eyes and the judgment that 9 years of attention had built into her without her having to think about it. They were in better condition than the Chester lot had been, not because they had been managed better exactly, but because they had been on a functioning operation until recently and had not suffered the specific neglect that comes from an owner who has already given up. Their teeth were sound. Their coats were full for September. They moved without the flat-eyed resignation she had seen in the Chester animals, which had been thin not just in body but in spirit, in the way that animals managed by indifference eventually go flat. She bought all 15 at $52 each, the higher price reflecting their condition. The addition changed the dynamics of the herd in the way that any significant addition changes the dynamics of a herd, which required attention in the first weeks, as the existing animals established their understanding of the new ones, and the new ones established their understanding of the land and the water and the rotation. Harriet ran the first 2 sections tight for 10 days, keeping the combined herd in closer quarters than usual, watching the social arrangements settle. There was some jostling. There was the expected testing at the waterline. Number 1 moved through it without apparent interest in the politics of it, as if the arrival of 15 additional animals was a logistical matter that would sort itself, and she had already sorted herself. By the end of September, the combined herd of 95 moved as a herd. She wrote in the notebook, Sep 28, 1,885. Combined herd integration complete, 95 head. Condition scores, original 80 at 3.6, Lewistown 15 at 3.3. Target by winter, full herd at 3.5 minimum. System continues. Aldous Krebs came out to the Vane property on the 3rd Saturday of September, alone, in his work clothes rather than his co-op clothes, which was a distinction she had come to understand as meaningful. He stood at the north pasture fence and watched the combined herd for a long time without speaking. 95, he said finally, added 15 from Lewistown in the second week of September. He nodded slowly. The Lewistown animals were visible as a loosely distinct group within the larger herd, not fully integrated into the movement patterns yet, but moving in the same direction, which was the visible evidence of a process that would complete itself without assistance. I want to try something similar. He said it without preamble. He had been building to it since July, and they both knew it, and he had arrived at the place where building to it was finished. Not on your scale, a trial. 20-25 head. On the east sections were barn 2 stands. I'd leave the barn in place and use the coulee on my east boundary for windbreak. She was quiet, thinking about the east boundary of the Krebs property, which she had walked past many times on the county road. The coulee there was shallower than hers and ran in a different orientation relative to the prevailing wind. The coulee on your east boundary runs northwest to southeast. The worst wind in a north-down event comes from due north. You'll get partial protection but not the full deflection. He looked at her. What would you do? Plant a shelter belt on the north edge of the east sections. Cottonwood or willow, something that establishes in 2 or 3 seasons. Run the trial with the shelter belt as the primary wind management and use the coulee as secondary. That's 2 or 3 years before the shelter belt is useful. Correct. He absorbed this. What breed would you start with? Highland, if you can get a comparable lot. If not, Galloway. They're less cold adapted but closer to Highland than anything else available in Montana. Where would I source them? I'd write to Meredith Pratt at the Extension Office. She's been tracking heritage breed availability across the northern counties as part of her research. She'd know what's on offer. Aldous looked at the herd again. You'd do the shelter belt first, before the cattle. I would. 2 seasons of establishment minimum before you want the protection to count on. He was quiet for a moment. That's a long way from where I am now, it is. But it's the right sequence. She did not answer that because it was not a question. He drove home. She watched the wagon go down the county road and turn east toward the Krebs property. He was a man who moved slowly toward large decisions, which was a characteristic she understood and did not fault him for. The important thing was that he was moving. October brought the anniversary of the purchase. 1 year since she had stood at the rail in the Great Falls sale barn and raised her hand in an empty room. She did not mark the occasion in the notebook except by noting the condition scores on the 11th, which was the date she had brought the original 80 home. Full herd, 95 head, average score 3.5 across the board. The Lewistown 15 had come up to match the established herd's condition in 6 weeks, which was faster than she had projected. The debt stood at $8,400. She had not written the debt number in the notebook since the first entry in October of 1,884, when the 11,000 had been the stone at the bottom of the creek. She wrote it now, in the margin of the October 11th entry, as a single line, debt $8,400. Then she sat and looked at it for a while. $2,600 paid down in a year, in which she had bought 80 head of neglected cattle for $43 each, wintered them through a historic blizzard, expanded the herd to 95, signed a lease, and negotiated a preliminary supply agreement. She had done this on an average variable cost of $11.40 per head per month. She looked at the number in the margin, then at the 11,000 written in October of 1,884 on the page before it, visible when she held the notebook open to both entries. At that rate, the debt cleared in a little more than 3 years. She turned back to the current page and wrote, below the debt line, projected clear, 1,888, 1,889, assuming stable costs and no major weather event. Then she underlined no major weather event once lightly, as a reminder to herself that projections are not promises. The preliminary agreement with Walter Price converted to a formal contract in October. He rode up from Helena on the 14th, 2 days before the first hard frost, and they sat at the kitchen table with the paperwork. The contract specified 15 head at a price per pound that was 40% above the standard Angus cross rate at the Great Falls market, reflecting the heritage breed premium he had been developing with his Helena buyers. It included a provision for first right of purchase on up to 30 head in the fall of 1,886, contingent on the herd's continued condition and his buyer's demand. She read the contract twice. She made 2 changes to the language, both in the scheduling provisions, and he agreed to both without negotiation, which told her the contract was structured the way he wanted it, and the 2 changes were not the things he was concerned about. When they shook hands at the gate before he rode back to Helena, he looked at the herd moving through the section visible from the gate and said that most of the operations he worked with in the specialty trade had been built on inheritance or investment, and that what he was looking at was built on something he did not have a precise word for in the commercial vocabulary he ordinarily used. She did not give him the word. She thanked him and went back to the work. November came in the second year with less drama than it had in the first, which was not because the cold was less, but because she was no longer managing against the fear of what she did not know. She knew the herd now the way you know the specific weight of a tool you have used long enough that your hand expects it before you pick it up. She knew the rotation and the grass and the coulee and the creek channel and the precise angle at which the benchland caught the north wind. She knew which animals to watch and which to leave alone. The knowledge was not accumulated in the notebook, or not only there. It was in her hands and her eyes, and the particular quality of attention she brought to the twice-daily checks, which had become so ingrained that she did them with the same automatic precision she brought to reading the watch on her left wrist when she needed to know the time. Winter of 1,885 into 1,886 was cold but not historic. It was cold in the ordinary Montana way, which is to say it was serious and sustained. The 95 Highland cattle moved through the north pasture sections on the rotation, found the grass under the snow with their hooves, drank from the creek channel she opened each morning, sheltered in the Coulee during the 3 cold snaps that came in January and February. None of the cold snaps reached the temperatures of the February 1885 blizzard. None of them were easy. She lost no animals. The condition scores through winter held at 3.4, 1/10 below the previous winter's floor, which she attributed to the integration of the 15 Lewistown animals, and wrote in the notebook as a calibration for the following year. By March of 1886, the full herd had recovered to 3.6, above the previous March's average, which the notebook recorded as a trend and not yet a conclusion. Meredith Pratt's co-authored paper was submitted for publication in the spring of 1886. She brought Harriet a copy of the submission draft on a Tuesday in April, and when she came to the door, she had a different look about her, a quality of barely contained professional excitement that she was visibly managing. The paper was 41 pages. Harriet read it at the kitchen table over 2 evenings. It was built on the notebook records as the primary dataset and cross-referenced against the limited existing literature on heritage breed cold climate performance. The results section contained her numbers arranged in tables that organized them in ways she had not organized them herself but which were recognizable, were in fact the same numbers she had been writing in the same notebook for a year and a half, arranged now in a form that others could read and assess and, if they chose, replicate. The paper's conclusion was careful, more careful than Harriet might have been if she had been writing it, but she understood why. A conclusion in a scientific paper carries a different kind of weight than a conclusion in a notebook, and Meredith was protecting that weight by not overloading it. The conclusion said that the data from a single operation in Chouteau County, Montana, across 1 1/2 winters, suggested that heritage breed Highland cattle managed under specific unconfined cold climate conditions demonstrate significantly superior cold weather performance relative to model predictions, and that the results warranted systematic investigation across multiple operations and multiple seasons before broader conclusions could be drawn. It cited Harriet Vane of Larimer Crossing as the primary data source and the originating practitioner of the management system under study. She read the conclusion twice. Then she went to the kitchen shelf and took down the second notebook, the current one, and opened it to the entry from October 11th of 1885, the anniversary entry with the debt figure in the margin. She looked at the 2 numbers side by side the way the story of the past 2 years arranged itself in that single comparison. The research paper used her numbers to describe something it called a system. She had not thought of it as a system. She had thought of it as the correct answer to a specific question, which was what she had on one side of the ledger and what the land needed on the other, and how to make those 2 things agree. The fact that the agreement could be written in 41 pages and read by people she had never met was a consequence she had not anticipated when she raised her hand in an empty room. She wrote in the notebook, April 22, 1886. Pratt paper submitted for publication, 41 pages. Primary data source, this notebook, both volumes. Conclusion, cautious, appropriately so. System continues. Aldous Krebs planted his shelter belt in May of 1886. He rode out to the Vane property on a Saturday in early May to tell her, arriving in his work clothes, without the co-op manner. He had ordered cottonwood stock from a nursery supplier out of Billings, 60 trees planted along the north edge of the east sections in 2 staggered rows, the pattern she had described when he came in September. He had hired 2 men for the planting, and they had finished it in 3 days. He did not ask for her assessment of the planting. He told her what he had done as information, reporting to someone whose opinion he had decided to take seriously without making that decision into a dependency. She said the cottonwood establishment would take 2 seasons minimum, and he should not plan the first cattle purchase until the spring of 1888. He nodded. He drove home. On the last day of June, Soot died. She had been slowing for months, the hips progressively worse through the spring, the morning walk to the pasture gate taking longer and requiring, in the final 2 weeks, a rest halfway. Harriet had been watching it the way she watched all things that were on a timeline she could not alter, with attention and without false hope. On the morning of June 30th, Soot did not come to the pasture gate. Harriet found her on the porch, on the old canvas mat where she had slept since the first winter after Owen died. Soot was gone in the particular stillness that distinguishes the absence of something from sleep, and Harriet stood there for a moment with her hand on the mat, which was still warm. She buried Soot in the east corner of the yard, below the fence line, in the shade that the fence post threw in the afternoon. She did not hold a ceremony. She did not speak. She did what needed to be done, which was all that could be done, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She did not open the notebook. The cattle were in Section 4. They would be there until Wednesday. The hay sheds were supplied. The water line was working. The lease was current. The contract with Walter Price was in the kitchen drawer. The research paper was in review. The debt stood at $6,800, down from the $8,400 she had written in October, down from the 11,000 that Owen had left when the pneumonia took him in February of 1,882. She sat at the table. The watch on her left wrist read 8:15 in the morning. The light was coming through the kitchen window the way June light came, horizontal and long, and the north pasture was visible from where she sat, the cattle moving through Section 4 in the unhurried way of animals that understood they had all morning, and the morning was sufficient. She thought about Soot at the gate. Every morning for years, the ears forward, the working dog attention that never fully converted to rest, the dark eyes that tracked the cattle from the gate with the precision of an animal that understood its job was to know where they were, not to intervene unless intervention was required. She had been good at her job. She had been good at it until the morning she was not there to do it. Harriet sat at the kitchen table until the light moved past the window. Then she got up and went to the north pasture gate and stood there and watched the cattle in Section 4. She stood where Soot had always stood. She counted 95. The notebook on the kitchen shelf held 2 volumes now. The first in Owen's handwriting for the first 40 pages, and then in hers for the rest, and the second entirely in hers. And when the second was full, she would begin a third in the same hand. The grass in the benchland was coming in the way it comes when the conditions are right, without announcement, simply present in the morning, where it had not seemed to be the morning before. Cattle moved through it. The watch kept its time. Aldous Krebs passed on the county road that afternoon, his wagon moving slowly in the way it moved when he was working on something. He slowed at the fence line and looked at the cattle in Section 4, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the calculation he had been running since February of the previous year when the storm cleared and the numbers came in. He had planted 60 cottonwood trees in May. He had stopped coming to the co-op on Tuesdays to talk about things he was no longer certain of. He was a man changing the shape of what he believed was possible, and that was a slow process. And she understood it because she had done it herself, in a sale barn on an October afternoon in 1,884 when she raised her hand in a room full of people who had already decided and held it there until the gavel came down. He drove on. The benchland ran north from the pasture fence in the long light of the last afternoon of June, the grass moving in the small wind that came up in the evenings, the lease section visible past the north fence line, the land that had been sitting in the land bank's listings since 1,882 and which was now hers to work. She had checked the grass height on the lease section twice in June. It was coming in well. In the fall, she would be ready for it. She stood at the gate as the light went long and golden across the grass, and the cattle moved through Section 4 with the quiet purpose of animals that knew their work, and the crack across the face of the watch on her wrist held at the same line it had always held, from the 2 o'clock position to the 6, and the watch kept the time it had always kept, and the evening came on over the benchland the way it always came, without asking permission, without announcing itself, simply arriving the way right things arrive when the conditions have been prepared for them.